You may proceed, Mr. Polreiter, and please unmute.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Xiheng Chen will defend the academic thesis towards an integrated environmental permit in China, a legal study based on EU regulatory experiences. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
I think we're missing the candidate.
Yeah, exactly.
You support, please reply.
Apologies for the inconvenience.
There's
There's the candidate.
Xiheng Chen, can you hear us?
Yeah.
I'm in.
Yes, you're welcome to this session in which you will inform us about your thesis and will defend your thesis by responding to questions. I hereby open this academic ceremony in which you, Xiheng Chen, will defend your academic thesis towards an integrated environmental permit in China, a legal study based on EU regulatory experiences. May I invite you to present a summary of your study, and we're looking forward to hear about the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Dear Prorector, dear members of Corona, dear supervisors, dear colleagues and friends, I'd like to present you an outline of my research with the name of Towards an Integrated Environmental Permit in China, a legal study based on EU regulatory experiences. To begin with, let me introduce the background of my research. We are faced with the hydra-headed ogre of pollution. This means that the separate actions against pollution to each environmental media would not be effective because they would encourage the transfer of pollution from one media, such as the air, into another, such as the land. Therefore, regulators have explored another strategy. The idea of integrated environmental permits to combat industrial pollution was already introduced into the legislation in 1996 at the EU level by the Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control Directive, and later was transformed into the Industrial Emissions Directive in 2010. In China, an integrated approach to environmental protection have been embraced as a core in a set of national policies. Particularly since the 13th National Five-Year Plan in 2015. And against this background, the idea of integrated environmental permits was introduced by the Administrative Regulation on Emissions Permitting in 2020, and also into other relevant legislation. Therefore, we can see that the EU's emissions permit system that have been ongoing for over 2.5 decades can be used as a helpful reference for to understand the China's emissions permit system towards integration, since it only is still at its embryonic stage. Therefore, my research question is, to what extent the new regulatory design of the emissions permit system in China, considering the EU regulatory experiences and seen from the specific perspective of the China, provides possibilities for or barriers to the implementation of integrated pollution prevention and control. In order to address this research question, in Chapter 2, I developed a conceptual framework on the basis of literature review. The concept of an integrated environmental permit falling within the scope of internal integration consists of 3 dimensions. While the substantive integration concerns the content of permit decisions, the procedural and organizational integration concerns the form of permit decisions. According to the literature, effective procedural and organizational integration provide a prerequisite for the substantive integration, but they do not necessarily determine the achievement of substantive integration. Among these 3 dimensions, substantive integration may be the most important one, which could be further understood from 2 perspectives: the scope and the environmental effectiveness. Furthermore, due to the incommensurability of environmental goods, an integrated approach has to be based on weighing and balancing all relevant factors that result in trade-offs between different environmental goods. Theoretically, there are 2 options for environmental trade-offs, and in terms of which option is the best for achieving substantive integration, there are different arguments. On the one hand, the arguments for case-specific options consider that given the infinite peculiarities of individual situations, only if we consider as much relevant factors as possible can we make better environmental trade-offs. However, on the other hand, it is criticized that to consider all relevant factors is not feasible in the real second-best world. And it is further warned that a specific decision of lowering environmental requirements for economic benefits may be easily disguised as a allegedly integrated case-specific environmental trade-offs. Therefore, it is argued that generic requirements are necessary for achieving substantive integration. Furthermore, there exists a challenge of simultaneously applying a permit instrument and market-based instruments to pollution control in view of an integrated approach. Therefore, the interactions between these 2 systems should also deserve analysis. So, on the basis of the above conceptual framework, Chapter 3 examines how the EU's emissions permit system on the basis of the Industrial Emissions Directive has been developed towards integration. The core findings of this chapter are that regarding substantive integration, the scope of the IED permit instruments concerns not just emissions, but also other environmental issues. Meanwhile, the interaction between the IED and the emissions trading system may hinder the greenhouse gases emissions limit values from being integrated within the emissions permit system. And this can constitute a limit to the scope of integration. As to the environmental effectiveness, the IED aims to achieve a high level of protection of the environment as a whole. More specifically, the achievement of environmental quality standards have to be considered in the emissions permit, but the relevant rules are vague. As to the options for environmental trade-offs, it is found that a combined use of a generic approach and a case-specific approach is adopted. Precisely, the generic approach is mainly indicated by a set of generic requirements. At the same time, member states have various degrees of flexibility, which allows room for case-specific decisions making by the national authorities. This triangle shows the different degrees of flexibility left for national authorities. And in particular, quite a lot of flexibility is mainly based on a set of vague rules. However, it is not evidence that the flexibility on the basis of vague rules can guarantee effective case-specific decisions for achieving integration. In practice, it is found that there is little information about the impacts of the IED implementation in the aspects of environmental issues other than emissions control. And in these aspects, member states have more flexibility on the basis of vague rules. And this also indicates a relatively narrow scope of integration in practice. Nevertheless, in national practice, a few cases can be found as the derogation clause from those BAT associated emission levels is used for dealing with cross-media effects by national authorities. And this shows that abandoning the flexible approach is not favorable in view of an integrated approach. Regarding the procedural integration, the IDD does not require to establish one procedure, but requires the member state to establish a coordination mechanism where several procedures exist, but the relevant rules are vague. As to the organizational integration, the IED does not provide for rules on this issue due to the subsidiarity principle. And then with the same focus, in Chapter 4, I examined how the China's emissions permit system has been developed towards integration. The core findings of this chapter are that regarding substantive integration, the scope of China's emissions permit system at least covers various emissions into the air, soil, and water, as well as pollution caused by industrial solid waste and industrial noise. As to the environmental effectiveness, concrete levels of environmental quality demonstrated as quality standards are also required to be achieved by the emissions permits, but the relevant rules are vague. As to the options for environmental trade-offs, it is found that a combined use of a generic approach and a case-specific approach is adopted. Precisely, the generic approach is merely indicated by a set of generic requirements, particularly including a set of absolute binding generic emission standards and technical specifications that are established at the national level and provincial level. Well, at the same time, except those absolute binding generic requirements, permitting authorities also have some flexibility on the basis of vague rules to set stricter permit conditions or permit conditions out of the scope of those generic requirements, which indicates the case-specific approach. Regarding the procedural and organizational integration, the administrative regulation on emissions permitting establishes one procedure covering various emissions by single authorities, as well as establishing the coordination with other regulatory instruments. And as to the interaction with the market-based instruments, there is no rule on how the emissions permit system should interact with the market-based instruments. So, on the basis of the above analysis, Chapter 5 provides a comparative discussion and also the conclusions. The conclusions are, regarding substantive integration, the emissions permit system in China presents regulatory possibilities for controlling emissions into the air, water, and land in an integrated manner. Furthermore, the integration of greenhouse gases emissions in China's emissions permits also seems possible, but such possibilities should be further clarified by the Chinese legislator. As to the environmental effectiveness, China's emissions permit system requires concrete levels of environmental quality to be achieved. However, since the relevant rules are vague, according to the EU regulatory experiences, it can be questioned to what extent such environmental effectiveness would be ensured. As to the environmental trade-offs, China's emissions permit system provides for a set of binding generic requirements, particularly without the possibility of derogation, and these binding requirements will legally limit the choice of an integrated approach in case-specific situations. Well, except those binding requirements, it also offers some flexibility for the permitting authorities on the basis of vague rules, which allows case-specific environmental trade-offs, but it may also result in permitting authorities not choosing the best solution for a high level of environmental protection. Thus, a better manner for combining mandatory generic requirements and the flexibility for case-specific permitting decisions should be further explored in China. At last, it is found that a relatively high degree of procedural and organizational integration is provided under China's emissions permit system, which may provide for better prerequisites for the substantive integration of permit decisions, but they do not necessarily indicate that substantive integration will be achieved. Therefore, it will be important to follow up these challenges by examining how the implementation of the current emissions permit system will be undertaken in practice, and then further to put forward to what extent an improvement of the current regulatory framework is necessary. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I give the floor back to the Prorector. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be started and opened by Professor De Kraker. Professor De Kraker was the chair of the assessment committee and is a professor of sustainability assessment at this university. The floor goes to Professor De Kraker.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidates, first of all, of course, I would like to congratulate you with this milestone with your PhD thesis. I found it very structured and clear, and also interesting and well readable, even though I'm not a legal scholar myself. But also from this outsider's perspective, I do have a few questions, also on the methodology, which, well, for me, the methodologies of legal scholars are always a bit difficult to understand. So I hope you can clarify this a bit for me. So as I understand it, your aim was to learn from EU regulatory experience to develop recommendations for improvement of Chinese legislation, particularly on integrated pollution control. And as an environmental scientist, I would then say, oh, that's a great opportunity because there are 25 years of experience in the EU with this type of legislation. And well, my burning question would be, how did it work out? Was the legislation effective in killing this multi-headed monster of pollution that you refer to also in your presentation? But when reading your thesis, I had the impression that, well, you had a different approach, but still you mention also in the title of your thesis that EU experiences were the basis of your study. So could you clarify how you define experience here? What kind of experiences you studied, and which EU experiences were most important in developing recommendations for improvement of Chinese legislation? I hope my question is clear. If not, then please ask for clarification.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much for your question. If I understand correctly, you are actually asking, you are mainly asking to what extent the EU regulatory experiences can be learned by the Chinese legislator, and also you're asking about ask me to explain more about the methodology. So I will answer your question consists of
yes,
two.
if I may interrupt. So how do you define experience? What kind of experience did you study in the first place? I would like to know, and how you studied them. Okay,
thank you very much. So then I start with defining the experiences because it is also relevant with the methodologies. In chapter 1, as I explained, I use a functional perspective to compare two systems. So and particularly, I want to identify what options for environmental trade-offs has been adopted in the EU regulatory approach, and then therefore, the experiences is mainly focused on these functions. And then in chapter 2, I has established a conceptual framework and identified two options. And then I have listed the disadvantages and advantages of these two options. And on the basis of these conceptual frameworks, I examined the EU's regulatory framework to identify what rules can really perform the generic approach and case-specific approach. And I believe that this can be a valuable experiences for Chinese legislator to learn. And in this view, I have find that, as I explained in my speech, a combined use of a generic approach and a case-specific approach is adopted in the EU emissions permit system. And then I further criticized that the flexibility on the basis of vague rules cannot guarantee effective case-specific decisions for achieving integration. And also, I pointed out that even though the flexibility on the basis of vague rules cannot guarantee case-specific decisions making, I do not mean that abandoning the flexible approach is favorable in view of integration. So this is the experiences that I can find in the EU, and then in chapter 5, I try to analyze whether these experiences can be integrated into Chinese legislation. Because in China, we also find that a combined use of a generic approach and a case-specific approach, but we can see that compared to the EU regulatory experiences, there are various degrees of flexibility. Some of the flexibility is based on the vague rules, but some of those flexibility are not necessarily based on the vague rules. And in China, the flexibility, I would say that is completely based on the vague rules. And in this way, I recommend that, okay, since the flexibility on the basis of vague rules cannot guarantee the effective case-specific decisions making in the EU, it may also happen in China. Then I delve into the specific situations in China and find that, okay, permitting authorities are faced with the shortage of the capability and resources in the issuing of permits. Then I can, on the basis of this analysis, I can predict that the flexibility on the basis of vague rules would not help effective case-specific decision for achieving integration in China. So this is the main recommendation that other regulatory approaches for providing the flexibility to the permitting authorities should be further explored. So
thank you very much. Thank you so far. I would like the opposition to be continued by Professor Chen. Professor Chen was also a member of the assessment committee and is a professor of environmental law at Wuhan University. The floor goes to Professor Chen.
Ms. Candidate, and actually my questions are based on the question from the colleagues or the colleagues. So your topic is a kind of a comparative study between EU and China, and based on the EU regulatory experience. So I'm very interested in, so since China and the EU are two different legal jurisdiction, they have sometimes they have a different culture, social, historical background and context. So when we conduct such kind of comparative study, especially when we draw some experience from the EU side, so what kind of experience are useful for China? So since they have some common sense, what are not for China? So this is my question. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for your questions. You're actually asking, there are huge difference between the EU emissions permit system and the Chinese emissions permit system. If I understand correctly, you are asking why I compare these two systems since they have quite a lot differences, and then you're asking what options and experiences should be incorporated into China and what should not be incorporated into China. And for the first question, why I choose to examine these two different systems is that first, as I explained in chapter 1, a comparative study has always start with identifying the common problems, and then to find the common responses to the problems. And then we can find that in the EU, they have chosen the permit instruments to combat the fragmented to pollution control. And also in China, they also choose, and the Chinese legislators also choose the permit instruments to combat the industrial pollution control. So I think this is the starting point why I consider to compare the EU emissions permit system and China's emissions permit system. Furthermore, let me just introduce another background is that in the United States, we cannot find this integrated environmental permit systems. So it seems that the EU, there exists, what I can find is that there is EU and China try to find the same responses to the same fragmented to the same problems. And your second question is what should be incorporated into what EU experiences should be incorporated in China and what should not. Well, according to my research, as I also mentioned in my last answers, that I think that first of all, I believe that the better options, the better combined use of a generic approach and case-specific approach should be introduced into the China's emissions permit systems. But in this research, I did not provide a further detailed recommendation. The reason is that I believe that a further detailed recommendation have to be based on to examine the detailed implementation of the current regulatory frameworks in the practice. For example, in the EU, we can find that the combined use of the generic requirements and the derogation clause seems to be more effective than those vague rules. But whether this combination should be introduced into China, I've just read a report that interviewed the permitting authorities in China about how they issuing the permits, and they are saying that they are faced with great difficulties in figuring out all those generic requirements. So in this case, I really doubt that whether the interaction of the derogation clause can really make the permitting authorities in China to make a specific decisions making. So at this moment, I don't think that the derogation clause would be necessary. But at the same time, at the EU, according to the EU regulatory experiences, we can also see that there are quite a lot of generic requirements. And at the same time, the IED provides some guidance how to make use of these generic BAT conclusions. For example, the IED prescribes that the BAT conclusions, the BAT associated emission levels have to be established in the form of ranges. And then the IED further prescribes that, okay, member states have flexibility to set completely consistent with these emissions levels, but they can also set different emissions limit values. And in this way, the IED pointed out or highlights the way they can make use of this flexibility. Maybe this can be a valuable experiences that we can learn by Chinese legislators, since, as I just mentioned, permitting authorities feel really confused on how to make use of these generic requirements. So in this way, I consider that maybe the most important and urgent step is to how to provide more guidance for the permitting authorities and the national authorities. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you so far. For the opposition, Professor Forer will continue. Professor Forer was also a member of the assessment committee and is a professor of comparative and international environmental law at this university. The floor goes to Professor Forer.
Mrs. Candidate, I very much enjoyed reading your book, and I want to compliment you on your book. I think it's the first study where you did a comparison of the integration achievement in environmental law and policy in China and the EU. And with that, I want to compliment you. And I want to make your life easy, since I'm asking the same type of questions on the related topic that also my colleagues were asking. And it all has to do with the central issue of, do we want generic rules or do we want location-specific rules? And there, I want to challenge you a little bit more on your own opinion, especially when it concerns the concept of BAT. As you know, in Europe, we had quite a bit of debate on BAT. Should it on the one hand be generic? But that would mean if we make it generic, that also emission standards would become generic. And because the location specific circumstances, let's say between Ireland and Greece, are completely different, that may not lead to a similar environmental quality. It is therefore that people have indeed pleaded in favor of this case-specific approach, which would then mean, of course, that your emission standards vary. And then the EU found that problematic, let's say, from the internal market perspective. So let's say you have been hinting at that a couple of times, but I want to hear your own opinion on that. Do you agree that if you take the harmonized environmental quality as a goal, that it means that by the end of the day, that BAT, the concept of BAT, should be differentiated? And so that's the one question. But then, and also, I was not too clear on how does that now apply in China? I read at several places in your thesis that you, with all due respect, you say a bit vaguely, there is a generic approach, but there is room for a case-specific approach. So now, very concretely, is it so that, for example, in Liaoning or in Chengdu, that BAT would be the same notion? Or may it be that we say in Chengdu, we apply, let's say, the BAT notion differently than we would do it in Dalian, for example, because we say that location-specific circumstances are different. I hope that my question is clear, and apologies for asking in a different way similar questions as my colleagues, because you hint at it, but I'm still looking forward for a more precise answer, Mrs. Candidate.
Colleagues, the opponents, thank you very much your questions, but I'm a little bit confused of your questions. What do you mean by BAT?
Best available technologies, you write about it 20 pages. BAT.
BAT, the BAT. Okay.
Yes.
So
your whole book is about it.
yeah, okay, because I do not really identify the pronunciation. So
okay, apologies for my Flemish accent.
I'm sorry, it's just my. So let me just further clarify. You are asking the relationship between the environmental quality standards and the BATs, and also could you just repeat the question? I just could not follow your question.
Very simple. Should BAT be harmonized or should it be differentiated? And of course, what you say is the following. You say BAT will be used to determine emission limit values, emission standards. That is the system of IPPC, of IED. Agree? And then you say the emission limit values will be determined on the basis of the environmental quality we want. That's the law. And so then my simple question is, you, soon to be, we hope, Dr. Cheng, what is your opinion as far as desirability of differentiation versus harmonization of BAT is concerned? I ask this because in the EU, it's a whole debate on, do we want to achieve environmental quality as standard, and that could mean differentiation, or do we also want internal market policy? Because a consequence of differentiation would be that emission standards, for example, in Ireland, might be different than in Greece. Is the question clear now?
Yeah, highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for your explanation. I believe that I understand the question. Actually, you're merely asked whether I agree the BAT standards should be harmonizations, or it should be differentiation, particularly considering the environmental quality standards? Well, actually, first of all, I need to clarify two concepts, which is I have spent a lot in chapter 3. I explained that there are different standards. First, the emission limit values, and the other is the emission levels. And I believe that the emission levels may be harmonized, because on the basis of the environmental quality standards, if we want to reach these environmental quality standards, we have to determine the total emissions that caused by all the operators, and that is the emission levels. And then we have the emission limit values. That is a concept that happens in a specific time or specific spots. And in the IED, it prescribes that the permitting authorities should set the emission limit values and to ensure that the BAT associated emission levels would not be existed. But under these levels, they have the flexibility to set different emission limit values. And then when we have the similar emission levels, can we have the similar environmental quality standards? So I do not see the really conflicts between these two concepts, because on the one hand, if we want to reach the environmental quality standards, we have to consider all the emissions level, total emissions levels. And then, but under this total emissions levels, we can have different setting of emission limit values. So I would answer your question in a simpler way. So yes, in view of the emission levels should be harmonized, but on the other hand, no, in view of the emission limit values can be different under the emission levels. I'm not sure whether I have clearly explained my point.
No, thank you. Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Tolsma, who was also a member of the assessment committee. And Professor Tolsma is an expert in decision-making and legal protection in environmental law at Groningen University. Floor goes to Professor Tolsma.
Thank you. Dear candidates, first I want to congratulate you with your dissertation. I'm very impressed by the amount of work that you have done and also by the excellent quality of your research. And a strong point in my view is that the central question is answered in a very structured way. And the design of the conceptual framework in chapter 2 provides guidance for this very detailed and impressive analysis of the pieces of regulation on the integrated environmental permit systems in the EU and China. At the same time, this conceptual framework triggers me to raise a question regarding organizational integration, because this is one of the focal points identified in the literature. But based on the theory described in the thesis, this degree of organizational integration does not seem to provide a very clear direction whether the result of substantive integration will be achieved. And this is also stated in proposition 4 belonging to the thesis. I have two questions. The permit system of the EU is not examined with regard to the degree of organizational integration. And the reason for this is, of course, that the EU does not provide rules on organizational arrangement given the subsidiarity principle. I wonder if you considered to dive in more in depth by analyzing the degree of organizational integration in different member states of the EU. And could you explain whether an analysis of the legal designs of EU member states on this topic could have an added value in this research? That was my first question. My second question is, suppose you were asked to give advice to a state on the regulatory design of the system of integrated permitting. What would your advice be on the degree of organizational integration? Would you recommend a single authority responsible for issuing the emission permit as required in China's systems? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and thank you very much for your question. You are asking two questions. The first question is regarding, I have compared, I have mentioned the organizational integration in my research, and in the EU part, due to the lack of the rules, I did not delve into the organizational integration to whether it will be valuable to integrate, to examine a certain organized arrangements at the member state levels would be valuable for the Chinese legislator. Well, I believe that it will be really valuable because it is. But I think it's most important to find a similar organizational arrangements with the regulatory cultures, because in China we have a really centralized structure, and we, as I explained in my research, there is one procedure covering various emissions by single authorities. So, well, to further compare. To do a comparative analysis between the Chinese emissions permit system and the specific member states, I think the first step is to find whether there is also similar regulatory design regarding the organizational arrangements, and this will make the research valuable and makes the research can be useful for improving the current regulatory frameworks in China. Especially, I have explained in my research that in China, though we have one procedure covering various emissions, we have also other procedures covers the use of water, the use of energy, and how they can be coordinated. So maybe for the further research, I will find a specific member states' experiences regarding this issue. And your another question is about whether I believe that one procedure is the best solutions in view of the organizational integration. Well, I would say that it depends. It depends on different systems, because as I explained in chapter 1, that in this chapter, I always acknowledge that all the functions are system specific. Maybe in China, one procedure covering various emissions can provide the prerequisites that different environmental goods can be weighted. But in the other system, this can also be made that while different environmental goods cannot be equally protected, because the authorities can have different views. So maybe in other country systems, there are several procedures that allows different authorities to discuss with each other and to coordinate with each other may be the best solution. But in China, I don't think this would happen, because as I explained, we have a really centralized situations, and I really doubt to what extent there will be the complete discussion between different authorities, or whether they can incorporate other opinions. Also, I explained that we have a relatively close procedure. So maybe in China, one procedure at the stage where I examine, I think is the best solution. Thank you very much for your question and your suggestions.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Eli Antonio, who was the last member of the assessment committee and who is a professor of European and comparative administrative law and procedure at this university. The floor goes to Professor Eli Antonio.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, also from my side, congratulations for having written a very clear, very well-written thesis. I was also, as it was stated before, particularly impressed by your thorough research, your mature reflections, and especially the very lucid writing style. I really think this thesis will be a reference study for Chinese scholars wanting to understand the integrated environmental permit system in European Union law. Now, my question for you today concerns the procedure to adopt the BREFS document under the Industrial Emission Directive. And you highlight in this respect in your thesis the relatively weak role of environmental NGOs in the process. So my question on the procedure to draft the BREFS document today is twofold. The first one concerns the applicability of the Aarhus Convention. So is the Aarhus Convention, in your opinion, applicable to the procedure and specifically to the Commission decision that establishes the selection procedure of the members of the Information Exchange Forum? And if so, do you think that the Commission decision, the procedure in general, is in compliance or not with the Convention, especially when it comes to public participation? Thank you.
Hi, esteemed opponents. Thank you very much for your questions. Well, thank you very much that you have suggesting about the Aarhus Conventions, but this has not been examined in my research. But I would provide more insights regarding the weak roles of the environmental NGOs in shaping the BAT generic documents. Well, my opinion is that on the one hand, I do agree that the more concrete rules for the selection procedures should be provided to ensure that more environmental NGOs to participate into these procedures. But at the same time, I also doubt that to what extent they can really take the role in the drafting of these BAT generic documents. As I explained in this chapter, and also I refer to a literature that interviews different groups that participate into these procedures. According to the environmental NGOs, they feel that they lack enough resources and they feel that they lack of enough capabilities and information to provide really substantive suggestions for improving to providing this substantive this specific techniques to make better generic environmental trade-offs. But at the same time, I can also find that there are industrial groups that has challenged the part of the BAT conclusions before the European Court of Justice, which can show their dissatisfaction about the BAT conclusions. And why is this the case? I found that in the process of adopting the BAT generic documents, in the second procedure, the ID actually established a relatively closed procedures that can reduce the impact from the industrial group. So so on the basis of my research, though I did not examine the conventions, I may provide another recommendation that to what extent, since particularly we are faced with the environmental NGOs, our lack of enough capability, to what extent we can reduce the impacts from the industrial group. And it seems that the closed procedures that allows member states, particularly some member states, are really willing to pursue the higher level of environmental protection. Maybe these closed procedures can better help to provide a better generic environmental trade-offs. Thank you very much your suggestions, and I will further continue to examine these office conventions to see whether I can better improve my research. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Scholl. Dr. Scholl is an assistant professor at the Sustainability Institute, and we're looking forward to the issues that he will address. The floor goes to Dr. Scholl.
Dear candidate, dear Xiheng, let me join the colleagues with congratulating you for this great thesis, this great achievement. I really read your thesis with great interest. I think it's very well structured, very well thought, and conceptually also very well trained. So I learned a lot, but nevertheless, I have questions. Two questions concerning your title, the title of your thesis. Let me start with the subtitle. In the subtitle, you say a legal study based on EU regulatory experiences. Well, first of all, I wonder why you would not have said a legal study based on EU and Chinese regulatory experiences. But beside of this, I was also wondering in how far this is not a rather strange title for saying that you did a comparative research. Various of my colleagues actually in the previous discussion have pointed out that you have done a very good comparative research. So have you done actually a comparative research, or was it a different methodology you were aiming for? And either way, I wonder whether there is not the danger of learning mistakes if the Chinese integrated environmental permit wants to base its design on lessons from Europe. Have there been learned mistakes? And then the question about the main title. Your main title says towards an integrated environmental permit in China. Well, I wonder whether the word towards does not indicate an inherently normative orientation that your entire work has. And I would like to invite you to reflect on this. Have you, by focusing exclusively on an integrated environmental permit as a way of internal integration, not excluded other forms of internal integration that may be equally relevant here? I'm looking forward to your answers.
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for your comments and thank you very much for your questions. You are asking two questions. If I understand correctly, the first question is about the subtitle, why I just said a legal study based on EU regulatory experiences, but exclude the Chinese regulatory experiences. Whether I really do the comparative analysis between these two, if I understand correctly. The reason why I only mentioned the EU regulatory experiences is that, as I just mentioned in chapter 1, the EU's emissions permit system that have been going for 2.5 decades. So there are lots of regulatory experience that I can gain from the implementation, not only the IED, but also the IPPCDs. But in China, yes, we have some regulatory experiences, but to what extent these experiences is relevant with the integration, I would say there is a field, though, as I explained in chapter 4, though the Chinese emission, the initial use of the permit instruments has started 30 years ago, but the start of the with the idea of integrating environmental permits was just integrated, particularly since the 13th National 5-Year Plans. So I would say that if I in the subtitle, I consider that this is Chinese regulatory experiences towards integration, it will be strange because, as I explained, China is just still at its embryonic stage. And your second question, I'm not sure I really understand, because you are talking, you're asking about the word of towards. Do you mean are you asking why I use this the words of towards? do not really follow your question.
Well, let me phrase it differently. I was wondering whether you think that actually the integrated environmental permit as a strategy for internal integration is really a way forward, or the way forward, or whether we also need to consider other form of internal integration in order to address the many-headed monster that you mentioned at the very beginning.
So you're actually asking there are different forms of integration. There are different forms of integration. Why I just discussed an integrated approach towards internal integration? Is that what you're asking? What you're asking? Okay. As I explained in chapter 2, there are actually two forms of integration: internal integration and external integration. And also, I explained that the concept of integrated environmental permits falling within the scope of internal integration. So the main focus is given to the internal integration, but in the main title, I only use the integration. I would like to explain in this way that because internal integration and external integration are not separated things. They are actually have interrelationships. According to literature, the internal integration can provide a prerequisite for achieving external integration. So the main title I said towards an integration, towards an integrated environmental permit in China. This, on the same time, can better achieve the internal integration, and when the internal integration have been improved, it could further achieve the external integration. So I believe that I hope that I have explained why I set the title in this way and why I focus on the internal integration, but also discuss the external integration due to their interrelationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. As it is, we've concluded the first round, which is always nice. And it's a custom at this university that if we start a second round, that a member of the degree committee who's from further away gets the floor first. So I'm inviting Professor Qin, if he would still have another question that he would like to put forward, then he gets the floor.
Thank you, moderate. I don't have the second round of questions for the candidates. Thank you.
Okay, then I move back to Professor De Kraker. Would Professor De Kraker still have another issue or question that he would like to address?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I actually do have another question, and yeah, it's about well, what has been discussed several times. This sort of learning approach you followed from EU experience and trying to learn from that to improve Chinese legislation. And well, there were already several issues mentioned. For example, China is very centralistic, whereas the EU has member states with a lot of independence. So that's an obvious difference. But of course, there are many more differences between EU society and Chinese society, which is the context in which legislation is applied. For example, the position of environmental NGOs, I think, is very different and much stronger in the EU as compared to China. So I was wondering, this different position of environmental NGOs, should that not be taken into account when you draw lessons from the EU for China? And if you want to take it into account, how would you do that? What would be the consequences of that?
Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you for your question. You actually explained that the different roles of the NGOs in the EU and in China, and it is that the NGOs in China are relatively stronger in the EU than in China. And you are asking whether I will consider this situation in China, and if I take into the account how I consider they in view of an integrated approach. Well, in China, in this, we do not have lots of stronger NGOs, but our legislation have established a rule that
Dear candidate, the beadle said that the hour has passed, but you may very shortly conclude your response.
Okay. Well, I may take the environmental NGOs into account, but I may really consider that they cannot play a very important role in shaping those generic trade-off, also case-specific trade-off. And in this way, when compare these two systems, I would consider that, well, okay, this happens in the EU, but because of the NGOs, but this may not necessarily in China. So this may be a negative factor if I would consider them into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Xiheng Chen, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return. There we are. Xiheng Chen. The degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Peters is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. The floor goes to Professor Peters.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Xiheng Chen, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisors, affixed with the official seal of the university, shown by the beadle.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, dear Dr. Chen. Also, on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you and your family with the degree you have acquired. I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their contribution and for the discussion. And after congratulating you once again and personally, I would like to give the floor to the members of the degree committee to congratulate you. But at the same time, I declare this ceremony to be formally ended. And lots of success with your career.
Dear Pro-Rector, there is no laudatio included in the online.
Oh, let me, yes, of course, there is mistake from my side. Of course, you get the opportunity for laudatio. I was moving forward too fast, which does do short on Xiheng Chen. The laudatio goes by Professor Peters.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Dear Dr. Chen, dear Xiheng, it's my great honor to congratulate you with this magnificent result, the successful defense of your PhD and the obtainment of the title of doctor. This laudatio, a short speech of honor to you, is of course also spoken on behalf of the co-supervisor to your thesis, Professor Li Ziping from Sun Yat-sen University, your home university in China. Professor Li will address a few words to you as well in a very short while from now. Dr. Chen, when we met a bit more than 6 years ago, I immediately got impressed by your thorough thinking and analytical attitudes. This first meeting was in the year 2016, when I visited your home university with the beautiful green campus in Guangzhou. It was upon invitation of Professor Li. At that time, you were completing the Master of Environmental and Resources Law, a master taking 2 years. I think China wins from Europe when we would count the 2 or even 3 year lasting masters specifically focusing on environmental policy and law. Here in Maastricht, we only have 1 master course in environmental law for only 6 ECTS. The elaborated master you have followed provided you with a good preparation to embark on a PhD research in environmental law. Dear Xiheng, there is a little anecdote to tell about this first meeting. At that time, you did not introduce yourself as Xiheng. Instead, you invited me to call you Max, as also the daughter of the famous Mr. Zuckerberg is named. Related to that, you told me about your dream to experience the Western culture and to develop your academic skills in the United States, in Canada, or Europe. Luckily, with the advice of Professor Li, you chose Europe, and particularly our university here in Maastricht, where you were hosted by the Maastricht Sustainability Institute. Nonetheless, a while later, and after your arrival in Maastricht, you abandoned your Western name and invited everyone to mention you with the name given by your parents, Xiheng. Dear Dr. Xiheng Chen, I think you made a very good choice to compel us Europeans to make an effort to practice at least your Chinese name, since you made such a big effort to learn our academic language, English, the language in which you have now so eloquently defended your PhD. At that time, in 2016, Professor Lee had already selected you as a candidate to study and to conduct a PhD. Given earlier research experiences with your predecessor, Xiheng Chen, I was confident that we would embark on a good research project with, again, a good candidate being you. This has now resulted in the fact that the law school of Sun Yat-sen University has, by now, 2 experts on core regulatory instruments in the field of environmental law. To explain this to the audience, while you, Xiheng, have examined the so-called command and control instrument to regulate industrial emissions in an integrated way, the other Dr. Chen, Xiheng Chen, studied the market-based instrument of emissions trading, a very sectorial and almost contrasting instrument. I think that the law school of Sun Yat-sen University now stands out for having 2 experts on core instruments of environmental law, and I would like to congratulate Professor Lee with that as well. Dear Chen, Xiheng, what I found particularly special in your research is your capability to develop the conceptual framework on how to assess the integrated environmental permit. Such a conceptual approach too often lacks in traditional environmental law research, particularly also the comparative research. You have developed your own unique assessment framework based on insight of others, such as Professor Bohne. This really reflects that you did not go the easy road, but went the extra mile by spending a lot of effort to develop that framework. The first one that, according to my knowledge, exists in the legal literature with regard to the integrated environmental permit. After you succeeded with this conceptual framework, you could proceed with assessing the EU regulatory approach. And I am not overstating if I say that I have not yet seen such a sharp analysis of the EU regulatory approach towards the industrial permit thus far. Then you proceeded to assess the Chinese regulatory framework, thereby also providing recommendations to the Chinese legislator. You have carried out your research in the difficult COVID time, and in the few weeks preceding this defense, you had a hard time by combining taking care for your sick family members and for preparing to this defense. You have this week even lived in total isolation, also to prevent to become sick. The song, Save Me, Save You, to which you refer your Proposition 9, probably kept you moving on, and hopefully will proceed further, you will proceed further with research in the environmental law domain. Xiheng, you have proven, according to my opinion, to be a strong academic with great capacity. I wish you all the best with your further career, and I do hope that your insights can indeed help to shape the improvement of Chinese environmental law. I now hand over this laudatio to Professor Lee if she is available in this online meeting. But before I do, I want to conclude by expressing my deep gratitude to you, Xiheng, for the research that you have delivered. And I would also like to extend my congratulations to your mother and your father who have supported you so well. Congratulations.
Thank you. Let's see if Professor Lee is still available. No, regretfully, well, let me first also express that it was a well-deserved laudatio, and which it's a good thing that we didn't miss this. So it's a well-deserved doctorate for both for you and your family, Dr. Chen. So hopefully you will enjoy this also in a successful career from now on. But one way or the other, I have to conclude this session given the absence of Professor Lee, regretfully, but there will definitely be contact with her. Once again, congratulations from Maastricht University for you and your family. And thank you once again, the members of the degree committee. And we can still stay on internet, but I hereby formally declare the ceremony to be ended. And I'm happy to